This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Well, thank you both for being here. Thanks again, Chris, for coming up from all the way from Los Angeles. I want to know if you can just tell us how the LA Rebellion project, you talked about it in the opening, but I'm wondering if you could just sort of talk about how, obviously there was a kernel of an idea, then brought into a larger project, and how you put it all together, the scholars you worked with, the process of bringing the filmmakers together, kind of extrapolate that a bit for us.
Okay. Well, when we started the project, like I said, we knew a couple of filmmakers, and then basically I did the project with Allie Field, who had just come to UCLA as an assistant professor and who worked in African American films. So I brought her into the project, and then which ended up being another stroke of absolute luck was that right around the time I was starting to apply for grants to fund the project, Jacqueline Stewart calls me up and says to me, and she was already at that time an assistant professor, I think, at Northwestern, and she says to me, well, she wants to learn how to be an archivist. Can she come and intern with me? And I go, Jackie, you're a professor. What do you want to do that for? She says, well, I want to learn about archiving. So she actually spent a year working in LA, going through the Moving Image Archive Studies program, and also then getting heavily involved in this project. And so the three of us started, first of all, by doing oral histories with all of these filmmakers. So that was part of the setup that the Getty Foundation, which funded gave us the seed money for the project. They said, first we want you to do research. So they actually funded all of these oral histories. We ended up doing about 30 oral histories, and then talk to one person, find out about somebody else, and that's how we finally came to this astonishing figure of almost 50 filmmakers. Now, not all of them became professional filmmakers. Some of them, somebody like Bernard Nichols, who made some great short films, ended up first trying to make it as setting up a distribution company to produce the work of the LA Rebellion and other independent African-American filmmakers, and then eventually went and became a psychiatrist. And so that's what he does today. Others, like Alili Sharon Larkin, who made some beautiful films, became an educator teaching at USC in their elementary school and teaching kids how to make films, and for 30 years was making films with kids. And actually another film we discovered late is I Dream of Being an African Prince, which I love, which is a film she made with kids. And so slowly the project came together, and then obviously we needed a lot more money than we were getting from the Getty, so I ended up going to the NEA, we went to the Warhol Foundation, we got money for the website, and if you are interested in the LA Rebellion, if you go to ucla.cinema.edu, that's our archive website, and then we have actually a whole head page and then basically a research site on the LA Rebellion. That was funded by the California Council of the Humanities. And so over a 2-3 year period, it came together, and then we did the initial program, but we've been working, I said to the filmmakers, this is not just a one-time thing. This is not just thing, we're going to keep doing stuff. And so we just preserved another Haile Gerima film, Harvest 2000, and we're doing ongoing preservation as we get money and when we find films. So it's been a gratifying project from that in that regard. And now after this book came out, the final shot is in a couple of weeks we're going to release a 3 DVD set which will have 24 short films on it that will be available to educational institutions free of charge. We are not selling it because one of the issues, at least legal issues, with the films of the LA Rebellion is they really were guerrilla filmmakers. You know, this first scene in Bush Mama, that's Haile Gerima getting arrested by white cops in LA because they would just go out in the street and shoot without, you know, getting police permits or anything like that. And they would use music, if it wasn't original music that they or their friends composed, they would just use that music. So a lot of the short films have clips in them, music clips. And so when I was thinking about how to do this DVD set, for me it was either pay $150,000 to lawyers to clear all the rights, and then another $500,000 to the rights owners, or we put it together and distribute it for free and, you know, circumvent this whole issue of rights, which seemed a way to go. Instead, I got grant money to pay the filmmakers and not, you know, the lawyers, which is always a good thing as far as I'm concerned.
So what was the restoration process like on Bush Mama?
The restoration process on Bush Mama was not that difficult because he did have a negative that was in one piece, and so really in that case we just had to make a new print. For me, the restoration process isn't finished though, because what we eventually want to do is actually take the negative and blow it up to 35 millimeter, as we did with Bless Their Little Hearts and with Killer of Sheep, because nowadays, I mean, you can still show 16 millimeter here, but I tell you that most universities are tearing out their 16 millimeter projection, and they only want to have video from this point on. And so 16 is more or less a dying format, except for, you know, avant-garde films and stuff like that. So for long-term preservation, we want to have a 35. But, you know, there were other films that were, I mean, Jama Fanaka's first short film, Willie Faust, we found, Jackie and I spent a whole day in his shed in Compton. He had one of these storage sheds, and in 90-degree heat, and after 8 hours of searching, we found this one reel in the dirt in the very back of the shed, and that was his first film. Or Malvona Ballinger's film Rain, which is an absolutely beautiful film. The only thing that's, because she passed in 2003, the only thing that survived on that film was a bad transfer, a telecine transfer on 3/4-inch tape of her 16 millimeter work print. And so that film we had to digitize and do cleanup on, and it was, I mean, that literally was the only material. And in many cases, there was exactly one element we found, and that was it. And so we'd have to, you know, make sure that it was preserved in a way so that, you know, we could show it and also distribute it at some point.
Anna, I wonder if you can just sort of place this film in a kind of cultural, political context for the moment, both within Black auteur cinema, also the kind of alternatives to mainstream Hollywood, documentary, avant-garde cinema, global cinema, that period. What was going on in the 1970s? What was going on at UCLA? Why did these, this whole LA Rebellion filmmakers, why did they kind of come to these approaches to cinema that's quite different than maybe the other filmmakers at UCLA at the time?
Yeah. It's a provocative question because there are so many points of entry to answer it, but it's also a multi-layered answer to really address what was happening. But essentially you have to look at, or we have to take a retrospective gaze back onto that moment. And so you're talking about, in the wake of the Watts riots, you're talking about a period of transnational freedom, liberation struggles in Africa, in Latin America, and many of the former colonial outposts, and so there were these kind of global struggles going on around the world. And in the States, of course, we had the civil rights movement. Now, one of the problems was that with the emphasis on the civil rights movement and Southern oppression, places like LA and other regions in the country really sort of were let off the hook in terms of their oppressive structures and systems at work. So what happened was in 1965, the Watts riots was sort of brought on by a police shooting of a black motorist. And so the uprising occurred in reaction to that action. And as a result, the city was in turmoil. The universities were involved in the free speech movement, so there was turmoil around the universities. And so out of that, there was an actual shooting at UCLA. And with some of the black students who had come to study films, they were pushing for more of an ability to create films and to address what was going on. And so it wasn't that UCLA just decided, oh, well, we think we'll just have an opportunity for these underrepresented students to come and participate in the filmmaking school. It was a direct demand by the students themselves. Like Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without a demand. And so these students were demanding to participate and have some role. And they wanted to make films that were going to reflect their education. So one of the things that happens then is, as you pointed out, Chris, the way many of the professors were not necessarily supportive. But one of the things that Garima said that struck me in an interview, he said that one of the professors that he had listened to him. And he said what he wanted to do was to absorb and to try to create an art text that reflected their world-class cinema training. They were learning about neorealism and guerrilla filmmaking, the new wave. They were learning about classic Hollywood cinema. And of course, the cinema novo and imperfect cinema really appealed to him. And he said he just wanted the professors to listen to his voice and help him to execute his voice. And he said the only voice that was receptive to him was William Friedkin. He said, the guy who did The Exorcist. He said, because he had been blacklisted, so he was like, yeah, okay, if you want to do that, we'll work with you on that. And so, he was talking about, he said, but for the rest of the professors, it was really a difficult situation, but he said we learned what we wanted to do. And he said now one of the things that happened, and I think this kind of puts it in context. So they, as I mentioned in the opening framing remarks, they were seeing classic Hollywood cinema, and of course the racist representations and depictions of blacks and blackness really made them cringe, and like I said, want to get under the table and not deal with it. But they started seeing these films from Africa. Some Usman Semben's films. He was trained in Russian socialist realism, and so he really was doing these really radical, revolutionary texts that were about how to confront oppression. And so they wanted to produce films that reflected that. But one of the other elements of their sort of praxis, their filmmaking agenda, was that they wanted to make films that could not be co-opted into Hollywood, right? And as you can see, a film like that is difficult to co-opt into Hollywood, right? So so they really wanted to, but they also wanted to shed light on the community, because after the Watts riots, there were all these reports, the Moynihan report about black women and a matriarchy, and basically blaming black people for their own victimization, right? And so they wanted to make films that spoke to those kinds of social inequities, and criminal justice reform was a big part of what was happening at the time. So they were really intent on making films that spoke to the reality of the moment, that let them exercise their creativity, and to express a counter cinema, And one final point. One of the things that Garima said, he said, when we were in school, so we didn't want to, when we were trying to make our films, he said, we did not want to deal with any Euro-American films. We didn't want to see them, we didn't want to make them. He said, but then, when some of us got jobs and we had to teach them, we calmed down and we realized, okay, so there's something here we need to learn. So it was this whole, sort of being caught up in the moment. And so they really were trying to, not only address art in a powerful social critique, commentary, but they really wanted to find their own voice as artists.
I think one of the things that strikes me seeing this film again on a big screen is that this is one of the first films I can really think of made in this country that expresses pure Black subjectivity. Hollywood, of course, we know, had created a lot of racist images, and then it had gone over to less racist images, but even when you had a good African American like the Sidney Poitier type, they were still objectified. Just men and women, Black men and women were always objectified, were always put into some type of stereotypical situation. Whereas here, Garima, by not differentiating between dream and reality, between what we know may have happened and what we don't know, is expressing an overt subjectivity that is maybe the most revolutionary thing about this film, as far as I'm concerned. As you were talking, you reminded me of something. So I'm teaching this Black Auteurs class, but I'm also teaching one of my favorite undergrad seminars, Film and TV of the 1960s. And you were talking about this idea of a dream, and can you capture a dream? And even Garima mentioned that he wanted to make a film. Can you make a film like a dream? And I was reminded then of Robbe-Grillet and Alain René's Last Year of Marienbad, and it's that whole sort of way in which the story unfolds. You're not sure what's happening, when and where. And again, these students are seeing these films and they're being influenced. Like I said, they have this world-class cinema education. And so you can see those influences being played out in that film. One other thing, he was asked about, Garima was asked about the Blaxploitation films. And he said, oh my God, here we are trying to make our films and Sweetback comes out. And he said, I could not get into that film. He said, first of all, it was just the morality of this little kid and this having this kind of relationship with this older woman. And he said, I just was not there. That film did not appeal to me and it did not appeal to others. He said, because here we are in film school and we're trying to learn how to make a counter cinema. And we're thinking jazz represents pure art. It's a standard of Black cultural productions that we would like to emulate in our films. So, he said, so yeah, I couldn't, so the Blaxploitation was, clearly something that for Garima at least, was just completely counter and opposite of what he was trying to do. And he just felt that it set also what they were trying to do back. And he felt that with them trying to create a Black cinema, that it was really something that set their agenda back, set the movement back, but also in terms of inculcating an audience, for accepting new kinds of imagery was really problematic. As I write in the essay I have in the LA Rebellion book, though, Blaxploitation, yes, Blaxploitation was, however, unbelievably popular with African American audiences, as the LA Rebellion films weren't. And a lot of the LA Rebellion films, they have this, yes, they are critiquing Blaxploitation, but they're almost counter-exploitation in that it's a yin and yang situation. So even the title of this film, Bush Mama, could be mistaken for a Blaxploitation film. You have a Pam Grier film called Black Mama, White Mama. I mean, there are lots of tropes in this film that are playing off the stereotypes created through Blaxploitation.
And then the other thing too is that this film is produced as the Blaxploitation cycle of films has wound down, and so it's kind of a situation where, again, this is a student film, and Garima is trying to again play with and experiment with all these different kinds of visual formal aesthetics and elements, as well as produce this kind of revolutionary sort of dialectical montage idea where form and content come together, right, to create something new. And so it is the case, I think you're absolutely right, that we're looking at this huge popular group of films, But the problem also, as I was saying, was in another context, what I like to call the sort of prestige ghettos that these films, and also the films of Cinema Novo and Imperfect Cinema, didn't reach widely in some instances. I think in Argentina, perhaps they, I mean, not in Argentina. In Brazil, they did, they were popular. There were 3 stages of them. But yeah, so many of these films, particularly I know for the African films, they didn't get to the audiences that they were making them for. They mainly circulated in film festivals and universities, and so you're absolutely right. The Blaxploitation films were able to get this wide circulation, and these kids are in film school trying to create a new language that would appeal to an audience, but it was a chicken and egg situation. If they don't get before the audience, to see and to learn a new language that's not classic Hollywood cinema, 3-act cinema, it's difficult, to make that translation. So yeah.
One of the great ironies is that these all of the films of Garima, of Charles Burnett, of Billy Woodbury, of Larry Clark, had their biggest successes initially in Europe. They were being lionized in Europe in film festivals when they couldn't get a screening in Los Angeles.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, you made me think of Elvis Mitchell's comment about Blaxploitation cinema was that it had something that white cinema didn't, which was that they had heroes that won, right? So that one of the things about Blaxploitation cinema too, that it was fantasy, whereas what you're really looking at here is a very stark reality. So stark reality always plays a little less at the box office, if you will, than of course the sort of fantasy. But I'm curious, that maybe moving to what's that?
I was thinking we want to get the audience in.
Yes, I just wanted to ask one quick question just about aesthetics. About the use of kind of the 16 millimeter and the kind of the influences of those aesthetics beyond just the constraints, because the UCLA imprimatur does 2 different things. On one hand, provides an opportunity to make these kinds of films, and years later provides an opportunity to restore them. But I'm also curious about how the fact that this comes from student filmmaking that informs some of what you're looking at.
It is interesting too, not only the imprimatur of UCLA to be able to go on and perhaps have a career, but as Garima said, get a job at Howard University. Has been there since 76. But yeah, I mean, it's a student film, so obviously there are elements that I think speak to the freedom to experiment and to explore, and that on the one hand wants to manifest a mastery of film language, of sophisticated storytelling through cinema, while at the same time, again, manifesting the kind of guerrilla filmmaking that was necessary to get your films made. I mean, just the structure of the program, where their project 1 was where, the first quarter they showed up, they were given a camera the first year and just go out and, make something, right? And so, there's clearly this desire to immerse yourself within the training, within the aesthetics, and learn the history of cinema, which they did, and therefore could reject it. And that's really what was going on here. There was a real sort of concerted effort to reject classic Hollywood cinema, and so first world cinema, and then avant-garde European cinema was something that had appeals to them as well. But then the third cinema, the revolutionary political agitprop kind of cinema, was really what is at base underlining what's going on here in Bush Mama. This desire that really reflects something that Julie Dash once said. She said when she was trying to get Daughters of the Dust made, she said that one of the problems of getting that film green-lighted and getting funded in Hollywood was that she said, no studio executive who was white and male wanted to spend 2 hours as a black woman. So that idea of identification, with the characters and with the screen and with that story was a bridge too far. And so I think one of the things that's happening here is like you have to be willing to, do that suturing to this narrative and to having this primary identification with poor black people in the ghetto, living day to day, and that is not an easy lift for people who want to have escapist narrative with a very easy text and with a very logical beginning, middle, and end. So.
I'm also fascinated by the actors because, I mean, these were initially amateur actors, but they appear in film after film of the LA Rebellion. So Barbara O, who for me is just this unbelievable goddess, she makes Diary of an African Nun with Julie Dash. She's in also then later in Daughters of the Dust, as is Coralie Day, who is the kind of skinny woman.
Yeah, is Molly the crazy one who snatched the wig off? Yeah,
she's in that film.
She's Nana Pazant in Daughters of the
Simi
Dust.
plays the mother in or an African American woman where a young man steals her pocketbook in Billy Woodbury's first film, The Pocketbook. She is then later in another film by. I'm blanking out. Steve Tropian, not Tropian, Steve, I can't remember, I'll come in a second. But all of these actors appear again and again in the films of those directors as well as Jamal Fanaka. And so it really becomes a kind of ensemble. It's really fascinating to watch.
I'm glad you said that. One of the other things that Garima said was, he said one of the things that was important to him was to have a collaborative relationship with his actors. And absolutely, I mean, he brought the community in, and that was another big part of the aesthetic, as well as, the filmmaking logistics, really, to be able to make a film like that and to reflect the community, but to involve the community. It was a real, sort of collaborative project. And he said he found Barbara O through Larry Clark. He said because Larry Clark knew his script, and that Barbara O was in community theater. She was acting, and she was portraying Angela Davis, and so he brought them together and they talked. And he said one of the things that's important to him is to have that collaborative relationship with his actors, because they only get like a 1-to-1 shooting ratio, when usually you have like 1-to-25 to 1-to-44, so you can cut stuff and have the best, but it's like what you shoot, you use. And so he was talking about, but that doesn't mean that he said that he's not prepared. He said he'll go to his set and spend time there and walk around and really plan everything out, because you're making it on a student budget, and so, or as an independent, you don't have a big budget, so you have to prepare and plan. He said, but one of the reasons he doesn't like storyboarding is because it fixes you, and you don't take advantage of serendipity that happens. He said, so you're prepared and you're ready and you've memorized everything, but what you want to do is, if something really fortuitous happens, you want to be able to to just throw away that particular script in that moment, and then just take advantage of that particular magical circumstance.
And that collaboration also was behind the camera, because if you looked at the credits, Charles Burnett is on camera, Larry Clark is in it, Ben Caldwell, so who are all directors themselves. So everybody is working on everybody else's films.
Well, that's kind of like here with our production films. All the students work on each other's films, and it's out of necessity.
And what students have to remember too, this is all shot on film,
On
right?
film.
So you have to shoot it, you have to develop it, and cut it. So it's so there's also as much as there's serendipity, there's also concision and budget and kind of really training, because you run out of
And craft.
And craft. Right. You run out of, it's not like you shoot 25 hours and if you get something great, you just don't have the money. So I wanted to just, because of course we are talking about the archives, there's two very quick questions. And the first one is, it's more of a statement, but one of the things we think of as an archive is kind of dead storage for old stuff. Right. But I think what you've demonstrated through LA Rebellion, by the way, it's not a good quote, but I think what you've demonstrated through LA Rebellion is that archivists do more than just house things. They bring back, curate, narrate a culture, and that's part of what the LA Rebellion's about. And I thought, if you're willing to talk about it, what the next big project that you're working on, as a kind of preview of the kind of work that UCLA does, and I think almost kind of a continuation of what you've done here.
Okay. As I mentioned earlier, LA Rebellion was Pacific Standard Time 1. 2 years ago, Getty announced Pacific Standard Time 2, which is going to be called LA in LA, which stands for Latin America in Los Angeles. So the project that I came up with is, it turns out that in Los Angeles in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there were at least 6 theaters downtown that only showed Spanish language films from Mexico, Argentina, Cuba, to Latino audiences. All of these theaters and all of the neighborhoods were wiped off the face of the map after World War II, when the white city fathers of Los Angeles decided that Los Angeles had to again be a white city in order to bring all those soldier boys back who had passed through Los Angeles on their way to the Pacific War. And so they literally razed 30 or 40 blocks of Mexican neighborhoods and got rid of the Mexicans. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And so this Spanish cinema culture completely disappeared out of the cultural memory of Los Angeles. So I didn't come up with this myself. We had a graduate student at UCLA, Colin Gunkel, who wrote a book, which is now out, called Mexico on Main Street, about these cinemas. But I took this idea, made him one of my co-curators on this project, and then we are now going to recuperate the cinema, which is a lot more difficult than it sounds, because A, if you look at all standard film histories, you will not find a single word about Spanish language cinema from Mexico or Latin America from before 1960, because the ideology is Latin American cinema does not begin until the post-liberation cinema of the 60s. So even though Mexico was making somewhere between 50 and 100 feature films a year, even though Cuba, before the revolution, made at least 80 feature films, in Cuba it was official policy until a year ago to deny the existence of a film industry in Cuba before the revolution. And in most of these countries, the archival infrastructures are in either terrible condition or total disasters, so that we're now having to preserve a lot of this work before we can show it. Once we started doing the research on this project, which again, as we first got a planning grant and then an implementation grant, when we started doing the research, we found out that the largest distributor of these classic Latin American films was on Vermont Avenue in Los Angeles, and was called Azteca. We also found out that Mexican and other Latin American producers would often shoot their films in rental studios in Hollywood, because the infrastructure there existed the way it didn't in these countries. So, you know, we've now discovered that there was an indigenous Spanish language-based classical cinema in Los Angeles in this whole time period that covered distribution, exhibition, and production. And so that's the project that in fall of 2017 we're going to bring in a show, and then we'll take on tour. We also have a book planned, etc.
So you'll be back for that.
And you're right. I mean, maybe because I started life as an academic and then became an archivist, for me it's always been important not just to, you know, be a caretaker of films, but really also because who better knows what's in the archive than archivists to curate too. So that is important.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you to our guests.